that means we have to start. I want to just get a show of hands for how many people were in Jesus's presentation this morning where you talked about Gatsby? All right, cool. Just so that there's a bit of duplicate content in my presentation, but hopefully not too much. I'm going to be talking about using Gatsby and Drupal. Real quick, my name is Joe. I work at Drupalize.me. We produce Drupal training videos. We do training like the theming workshop we did yesterday. You can find me on the internet as EOJ the Brave. EOJ is Joe spelled backwards, the Brave, because I needed to sound intimidating so that I could inspire fear in the hearts of my enemies back in like high school, and it just has been that way ever since. This talk is going to kind of be split into 3 parts. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what Gatsby is and why it's cool. I'm going to talk about some of the different ways that you can combine Gatsby with Drupal and why you might want to do so, because Drupal is also really cool. And then I'm going to talk a bit about using Gatsby to go beyond just creating static, traditional static sites and creating more web applications and allowing for personalization based on users being logged in and that kind of stuff, and showing some of the ways that I think, some of the things that makes Gatsby unique in the realm of static site generators. Why talk about Gatsby at a Drupal event? For a handful of reasons. One, it's popular right now. People are pretty interested in it and are talking about it a lot, and it's a fun tool. I think that in particular for me, I think Gatsby is really neat because it's a really good way to practice and learn React, which is a skill that I think will be useful for a lot of people going forward. React is super popular right now. I think Gatsby is a really great way to learn React, in particular because you start to build real things very quickly, versus like writing React components where you're like, well, I don't know, I just need some like made up data to build this thing. Using a tool like Gatsby allows me to work with real data kind of without a whole lot of development that I need to do to get to that point. I can just start writing a React application. It also, for me, it has taught me a lot about front-end performance that I just didn't know, coming from traditionally working on Drupal themes. And the sort of Drupal theming environment tends to be a little bit behind where kind of modern best practices are with front-end. And it's interesting to me to learn about what those practices are and then figure out how I can come back and apply them to Drupal themes and the work that I'm doing there as well. It lets me play around a little bit with decoupled architectures. Another sort of trendy buzzword in the Drupal community right now is sort of looking at possible ways that we can step away from building monolithic Drupal sites and start to build more decoupled architectures. In particular, Gatsby made it quick and easy for me to kind of experiment with that and to learn about where some of the pitfalls in that are. And certainly I've spent some time playing with Gatsby. In a lot of ways, it's been awesome, and in some ways, it makes me go, wow, I really appreciate that Drupal has a login form, and all I have to do is turn it on. Like, that's pretty sweet. And just in general, learning new skills that will help you in your Drupal career, even that aren't Drupal specific. So what is Gatsby? Gatsby is a blazing fast site generator for React. It is a JavaScript project. It is open source. It's created by a company called Gatsby Inc. Gatsby Inc. it's like sort of not to be confused. There's gatsbyjs.org, which is the sort of open source community side of things. There's gatsbyjs.com, which is the incorporated company that sponsors development of Gatsby, but it's also an open source project, so there are a lot of community members around it. It's not unlike we see with some of the companies in the Drupal ecosystem and the way that they provide services for Drupal and around Drupal, but don't own Drupal in any way, but do contribute back to it. The Gatsby software itself is written in Node. As a person making use of Gatsby, you'll write a little bit of Node.js, not a ton. You will use React and GraphQL a lot. Gatsby's Node application uses React and GraphQL as part of the templating experience. Gatsby as a developer tool is really cool. It has some pretty neat tools for allowing you to very quickly learn how the system works and also to experiment in a kind of a cheap way and see, when I make this change, what happens? It's pretty neat, especially compared to learning theming with Drupal twig templates, where there is no really fast way to make a change and then see it occur on the page. It takes quite a bit of work in the grand scheme of things. You can find Gatsby at not this URL. The actual URL is gatsbyjs.org. At its core, Gatsby is a static site generator. What is a static site? Static sites are just HTML files, HTML, CSS, JavaScript files as well, sort of just standard web assets that have already been pre-rendered or hosted on a server. Apache, Nginx, Netlify, there are all kinds of variations of this. When a person views your site, they're just being delivered an already generated HTML file. Compared to something like Drupal, where when a person views a page on your Drupal site, it makes a request to Drupal, which does the labor of assembling the HTML sort of in real time, and then returning that HTML document, which we would consider to be a dynamically generated HTML page. It's kind of like how we used to, originally websites were just created by writing the HTML directly. Static site generators are largely about trying to make that process of writing just straight HTML a little bit easier and more manageable. Essentially, what happens with Gatsby, you write React components that represent the content that you would like to display on a page. In a sense, you use React much like a templating language, like you would use Twig in a Drupal theme. When you run the Gatsby build process, it uses all those React components to assemble an application that is a representation of your website. It renders that to HTML, which is, React is basically converted to the HTML DOM. At whatever state it's at, Gatsby saves a copy of that HTML. It is not really any different than a sort of traditional server-side rendering pipeline. It saves that HTML. User goes to your page. Once it's built those static HTML files, you upload them to the server. Somebody goes and views the page. They get the results of that output. The benefit of this versus just like writing HTML files directly is that you get some of the tools of a templating system where you could, for example, create an article template file, apply it to all of your article content. If later on someone wants to make a change to that, they don't have to go and edit every single HTML file. They just edit the one template file, run the build process again, and it's updated for all the pages. Gatsby is blazing, apparently. They say this all over the gatsbyjs.org website, so I had to spend a little time figuring out, wow, what's blazing? And apparently blazing is good. I like this quote from Andrew Clark. He says, tip, when evaluating libraries, check if it's blazing fast. If it's fast, but the README doesn't specify whether its fastness is blazing, keep searching. Often you can find a similar library that does the same thing, but blazingly. Blazing means good. So, I take this to mean that Gatsby must be really good because they say blazing on the front page of their website a whole bunch of times. Okay, so blazing is good. How do you get a blazing fast website? It's actually not super difficult. I am going to do something real quick, though. Don't mind me. I can't actually see my notes. So how do you get a blazing fast website? Not rocket science. You just implement a bunch of already sort of known patterns for best practices and measure some important metrics. You need to do things like implement HTTP2, or at least your server should. You implement patterns like PRPL, Rail, Flip, things that help with front-end performance of your application. Maybe you consider building a single-page application or implementing service workers to help speed up the load time of the page. You measure things like time to interactivity, time to first paint, first meaningful paint, first contentful paint. Maybe you want to make it work in offline mode so that when somebody comes back later to view the page, it works a little bit faster. Lots of things. All you have to do to make your site blazing is all of these things, which, to be fair, are a bunch of well-known patterns that you can implement. The thing is, implementing all of them is tedious. It takes time. You need to be able to understand what they all are and how to make use of them. How do you do that? You generally do things like make sure that all of your files are aggregated and minified. You do code splitting so that you're only delivering CSS assets to pages that need them and not to every page. You make sure you do scope hoisting for your JavaScript so you're not importing functions more than one time, all kinds of fancy things. That's really all you need to do in order to get blazing fast websites, which, again, is really good. I like this as an example of why blazing is good. Mike and Herschel in his presentation this morning talking about web performance mentioned that his statistic was something like if your site loads in under 5 seconds and somebody can interact with it in under 5 seconds, people generally see like a 200% increase in advertising revenue by just making the pages faster. Really fast web pages provide a better user experience. You don't have this problem where you go to the page and it loads and then you can't do anything because you're waiting for the rest of the the JavaScript of the application to load. Like, that's frustrating. Really fast websites provide better search engine optimization. Tools like Google Indexer definitely penalize slower sites. Generally speaking, when you've taken the time to implement a lot of the patterns that make your site blazing fast, you've also helped to make it more accessible. A fast site is more accessible not only to people that maybe have impairments that make it hard for them to navigate the site, but also more accessible to people that live in places that don't have the same amount of bandwidth that we're fortunate enough to have here, because you've helped make the page load smaller and quicker for them to load on their slow connections. So there's all kinds of benefits to doing this. Luckily, and one of the things that's really cool about Gatsby is Gatsby makes it relatively easy to do a lot of these things. Kyle Matthews, one of the creators of Gatsby, says this. He says, I designed Gatsby with the goal that when using it, it'd be really hard to build a slow site. Instead of the other way around, where you sort of typically start from, it's really easy to build a site. Now you need to spend the next 3 months implementing all of these patterns to try to make it faster. Gatsby does a lot of this for you out of the box. Gatsby does route-based code splitting. So it is smart about understanding what CSS and JavaScript are necessary for each individual page. So when a route or a URL that you visit, it's smart about splitting out the code so that only the code that's required to make the page that you're currently viewing work is loaded for that page. It does things like automatically inlining critical resources. So you can define sort of this CSS is critical for the page to work versus this CSS is just necessary if you want it to look exactly the way that it was designed. You can inline that so it's a bit faster and the browser doesn't have to make additional requests for style sheets. Gatsby does this super cool prefetch and pre-cache. This is the PL pattern I was talking about earlier, where it uses it's smart about when you visit a page and after the page is loaded and the browsers become idle, it looks at all the links on the page that are in the viewport. So you've sort of scrolled them into the viewport and it says, hey, that link points to another page on this same site. There's a good chance that the user might click on that link. So as long as the browser's idle, what I'm going to do is actually fetch the content of that page and stick it into the browser's cache so that when they do click the link, it's virtually instantaneous to navigate to that page. Gatsby does a lot of image optimizations. I'll have some more examples of that. With relatively little work, just by installing an additional plugin, you can also get support for service workers, which is pretty cool. In my experience, trying to do anything with service workers sort of manually or by hand is quite complicated, and it's neat that Gatsby mostly handles that for you out of the box. In addition to that, and I think the thing that probably makes Gatsby super powerful and unique is Gatsby's philosophy of using external data sources to collect the content that it's going to generate HTML files from. Gatsby has what are referred to as source plugins. Essentially, when you run Gatsby build and you have source plugins enabled, they can go out and ingest data from any number of different places, including Drupal. Sort of anything that has an API where you can get the data from. Gatsby pulls all that data in. It creates a GraphQL database at build time that, as a developer who's writing the React components that are going to define the site, I just query that I just query the GraphQL database and get back the data that I need. I think there's a couple neat things about this. One of them is that you can actually configure Gatsby to use multiple sources at the same time. So you could say pull stuff from the Drupal API, pull stuff in from a Google spreadsheet, and also pull stuff in from this like Shopify API. It pulls it all in to a unified GraphQL database. And now the front-end developers on the team have just one sort of source. They only have to learn one thing to be able to access the data. They just have to learn GraphQL. It's going to be all in that same place, rather than them having to learn all of these different APIs in order to get the data that they need. The simplest version of a Gatsby site is Markdown files. This is true of like pretty much every static site generator. You create Markdown files, you point the static site generator at a directory full of Markdown files, and then you run like my application build, and it goes off and it reads in all of the Markdown files, uses whatever your templates are, transforms that to HTML, and ta-da, you've got pages that are you can host on your web server. Gatsby does that for sure. That's kind of the hello world of a Gatsby site, is pulling in a Markdown file and then converting it to a HTML. This code example is just, I don't really expect you to be able to read all of it, but just to illustrate, this is kind of all that is really needed to, on this side, ingest content in the Markdown format, query it and say, well, I want a list of all the blog posts that were in the GraphQL database on one side, and on the other side over here, I'm saying use this template file to determine how to convert that Markdown into HTML. The template file is a React component. The code over here that determines which pages to display is Gatsby's Node API. Gatsby, similar to Drupal, operates with a ton of different plugins. There's sort of Gatsby Core, which provides the ability to ingest data from one place, build the GraphQL store, do server-side rendering. That's kind of all Gatsby Core does. And then you start to add in a bunch of additional plugins, much like you would do with Drupal, in order to accomplish different functionality. The most interesting plugins are probably source plugins, of which there are hundreds, that can query different APIs or file systems in order to pull in data into that GraphQL data store. This is that sort of like, wherever your data is, there's a good chance that somebody has already written a plugin to pull it into Gatsby. And if they haven't, it's not terribly difficult to write a plugin of your own to pull the data in. Like if you've got a legacy application in your environment that serves like a SOAP API or something, you could write a Gatsby plugin that pulls that data into its GraphQL store. And then transformer plugins, which are a lot like text format plugins or modules in Drupal, where you can say, this text field contains Markdown, and I'd like you to render it to HTML. But when you do so, I'd also like you to trim the URLs and do that kind of stuff. Gatsby uses transformer plugins at the time that it extracts data out of GraphQL to allow you to render Markdown to HTML, for example. You had a question?
Yeah. For the source plugins, does it only use post requests, or can it also use gets, or does it depend on what?
Sure. The question is, for source plugins, does it use post request or get request? It is totally dependent on each individual source plugin. Most of these that I've looked at just use JavaScript's native fetch API, but it's then like, are you making a get request or a post request? It depends on where it's querying the data from. There's also source plugins that are like the MySQL source, which is not going to make an HTTP request, just going to use Node.js to read directly from the MySQL database, that kind of thing. Basically, a source plugin, like how you can get data, comes down to like, if you can get at that data using Node, Gatsby can get at it with a source plugin. So that's a little bit about Gatsby and what it is and why it's pretty cool. I also want to talk a little bit about why use Drupal, especially in conjunction with Gatsby. Probably all of these things you're pretty familiar with already because you're at a Drupalcamp, but we'll go over it again just in case. Drupal has super powerful data modeling tools. The whole entity and field API in Drupal 8 is a really powerful feature, especially when using a decoupled architecture or trying to provide the data that is within your Drupal site in some kind of structured format that other clients can consume. Drupal is really, really good facilitating complex editorial workflows, especially when you need to customize it for a specific use case. More than almost any other CMS I've ever looked at, Drupal provides the ability for us as site builders and Drupal developers to create a really well-tailored editorial experience for whoever's going to be doing the work of creating content. I can tell you for certain, it is a lot better than asking people to edit Markdown files and commit them to a Git repository. Drupal has really fine-grained access control on content, but not just on pieces of content. It also has really good tools for providing access control on individual fields on a content entity, which can be useful when it comes to using an API to serve that structured data and being able to determine who should have access to which pieces of the data and when and why. Another reason that, in contrast to tools like Contentful or Firebase or lots of these sort of existing, I can pay you a few dollars a month to use that CMS. One of the reasons that people really like Drupal is it's open source and you can host it yourself. And there are still a lot of cases where that is a bare minimum requirement for building an application in this organization is we have to be able to host it on our own hardware, or it has to be open source. And there are tools out there that, while maybe easier to start with, like for example Contentful, aren't capable of doing those things. So that's a thing. Like I said, Drupal facilitates really complex editorial processes. Out of the box even, Drupal can do some really cool things with the workflow module. You can also add in additional modules that can make this do all kinds of other things. I bring this up again because I think that one of the things that Drupal is really good at and why it's still relevant in this sort of environment of, decoupled architectures, is that it allows us to create an application that is customized to the needs of the team that is creating the content for that site. And that is important because not every website or web application's needs are the same. You might have a situation where people just write blog posts and post them on the site, and ta-da, they're done. Or you might have something more complex where it has to go through a complex workflow of, I write the content, it has to be reviewed by a technical editor to make sure that it's correct, it has to be reviewed by a copy editor to make sure that I sound smart. It has to be reviewed by a managing editor to make sure that it fits the overall guidelines for the site, et cetera, et cetera. And what that workflow looks like can vary wildly between organizations. I also think a lot about Drupal as, in this situation, is that Drupal is a really good tool for allowing you to create a database and an application that can serve many different clients and many different use cases. When I think about should I build this application with a decoupled architecture, it's sort of well, maybe if the use case is I just need a single site, I just need to enter data into a database and then have it display on a single HTML page, probably not. Drupal can do that really well. That's what it was built for. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're creating data in your application that's going to be used in a bunch of different ways, you could think of Gatsby's integration with Drupal as just one tool in that quiver. You might have a situation more like this, where you've got a Drupal site that has a traditional front end built-in twig, but you've got Gatsby sites that are maybe landing pages or vanity domains that are used for marketing purposes. It's a little bit easier and quicker to spin those up using a Gatsby build process than it is to do so with Drupal. You might also have situations where your data needs to serve an Alexa device, or you've got business partners who need access to your data for different reasons and so forth. Drupal is really powerful in that situation. If you want to use Drupal and Gatsby together, on the Drupal end, there's the minimum requirement is you'll want to install the JSON API module. JSON API is a sort of zero configuration, give you an API for your Drupal site, install the module, you turn it on, it automatically creates a JSON REST API for all of the content entities on your site. That's the bare minimum requirement. I would also recommend installing the JSON API extras module, what it allows you to do is actually add some configuration to JSON API. Specifically, when using with Gatsby, it allows me to turn off all of the resource endpoints that I'm not making use of, and that can help speed up the build time for Gatsby. Because what Gatsby does is it goes and it looks at JSON API and it's like, well, here's everything that Drupal's exposing. I'm just going to ingest all of it. But if you're only using like one particular node type in your Gatsby site, well, turn everything else off and it'll only ingest that content. If you're going to do anything with user personalization, especially if you're using Drupal as the sort of source of truth for users or members, the simple OAuth module allows you to implement OAuth 2 authentication with Drupal as the OAuth server. If you're just playing around with this for the first time and you kind of want something easy to get started with, you could check out the Contenta CMS. Contenta is an API-first Drupal distribution that essentially what it is, it's Drupal with a couple of modules like JSON API and simple OAuth already installed for you, and some dummy content that you can play around with. Jesus talked about their Drupal installation, Buina, which you should also check out. I have not yet, but I'm assuming it's basically the same. But out of the box, you'll get JSON API extras. They've written some code for making it easier for writing and editing Markdown within Drupal, which can be a benefit when you're working with Gatsby. So those are two really good starting points if you just want to kind of play around with some of this. Thanks, projector. You guys know what that looks like. That's Drupal's editing interface over there with some fields on it. This is an example of what happens when you turn on the JSON API module. This is it takes whatever content you add into this node creation form in Drupal, and it turns it into this nice structured JSON representation of the data. So you get a powerful user experience that allows people to edit and add content in an intuitive way. That content, though, is represented in a machine-readable format that is easier for to parse with Gatsby or whatever client is parsing the data. You know, it's kind of like instead of giving users an interface that's like, set the value of this field to true or false, you can give them a select list in Drupal that's like yes or no, or answer this question. In the JSON API representation of the data, though, you can just have that be a Boolean value. All of this works with very little configuration between Drupal and Gatsby, because when you install the JSON API module, what it does is it implements a known specification, the JSON API spec, so that, and because it's a known format for outputting data, it allows a single Gatsby plugin to just be pointed at the main endpoint of your Drupal JSON API, and it can figure out how to traverse all of the different resources that are available, and you don't have to do anything special. This is neat because you can use Drupal just like you're used to. You can add any new content types. You can add fields to those content types in the way that we're accustomed to configuring Drupal. You don't have to do anything other than that. JSON API will figure out how to present the data to Gatsby, which can ingest all of that data without you actually having to really make any changes. On the Gatsby side, what you will need to do is use the Gatsby-source-Drupal plugin. So you would use npm or yarn or whatever, install this plugin alongside your Gatsby project. You need to provide a little bit of configuration for it, but it's super minimal. You need to tell it, well, here's the URL of my Drupal site, and here's the route on that Drupal site where my JSON API starts. Like that's it. That's all the configuration you have to give Gatsby about Drupal. And then you run Gatsby build, and it goes off, and it pings that URL, and it finds, well, there are 13 different content types listed here. And then it pings each one of them, and it gets all of the content for each of those content types. It just ingests that all into Gatsby's GraphQL layer. This is a little bit confusing for if you're a Drupal developer, because Gatsby refers to items of content as nodes, and Drupal refers to items of content as nodes, but kind of in different ways. But also in Drupal, in Gatsby, it uses Node.js for the programming. So it's Node API is like the Node.js API that you use to create Gatsby nodes. Anyways, what happens is Gatsby ingests all of this content from Drupal. It stores it in a GraphQL database. And then in your own Gatsby project, the part that you do is you write a GraphQL query that looks something like this. And you say, you know what? I got a bunch of tutorial content back from Drupal. What I want to do is make a page, or I want to generate a static file for every one of those tutorial nodes from Drupal. So I query and I get a list of them. I loop over that list that's returned. And I say, hey, when you build that page, use this template, this Gatsby template or React component to figure out how to interpret the returned data to HTML. Earlier, someone was in Jesus' presentation, someone was asking about how do you deal with routing within Gatsby. This is an example of how I've done that, where on the Drupal side, you've got you can create URL aliases, and you can set up the path auto module to automatically rename things from like node/1 to recipe/ chocolate chip cookies. That data is made available by JSON API, which means it's also available in Gatsby's GraphQL store. So I can query for it, and I can get the path alias. And then when I'm telling Gatsby what URL or route to use for building the page, I'll say, in this case, I say, well, if there's an alias defined, go ahead and use that path that was defined in Drupal. And if there's not, we'll just make up one. It's pretty straightforward. Some other neat things with the Gatsby and Drupal integration. The Gatsby source plugin is pretty smart about understanding Drupal's fields, specifically image fields. It can do some neat things. In this case, it's recognized that my site had a recipe content type. There's an image field on the recipe content type. When Gatsby ingested that, it said, oh, this isn't just a string of content. This string of content is actually a URL for an image. It downloads that image. It performs a bunch of transformations on the image so that when you're using it in your Gatsby site, it'll still work with some of the image optimizations that Gatsby provides for you with relatively little configuration that you need to do on your site. And you can get these kind of effects. This is the blur up effect. Basically, it loads a really, really small version of the image, stretched to fit the full size initially. Once the rest of the page is loaded, it comes back and sort of progressively loads larger and larger versions of it as the browser has bandwidth to do so. Things like this are not impossible, but difficult to do in Drupal. Doing something like this in Gatsby is like, well, you just add this, sorry, I keep saying but you just add this GraphQL fragment to your query, and then you use the Gatsby image component in your template file, and ta-da, it takes care of the rest of that for you. It's pretty neat. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why you might want to use Gatsby and Drupal together. Kind of a quick recap of that. Drupal is particularly useful in the situation where open source or self-hosted is important to you. Drupal has super powerful tools for creating customized editorial workflows that go beyond pretty much anything I've seen in other platforms. And Drupal, the fact that Drupal outputs data in JSON API, a known specification, makes it really easy for the Gatsby plugin to infer a bunch of information about your content without you having to do additional configuration. Okay, I also promised that I'd talk a bit about using Gatsby to do things other than just create static HTML pages. And I think this is something that's really neat about Gatsby, and especially in comparison to other static site builders, where you're kind of limited in that you've generated the page. Now every single user that views the page is going to get the exact same experience. Fine in some cases, maybe not optimal in others. Using Gatsby, which is generating React applications for us, we can do things like serve a static page to users, but then recognize that maybe this user is authenticated by an OAuth session and start to make modifications to the page based on the fact that they're an authenticated user, like display their name, or display a list of articles that's relevant to them, or things that they've read previously, all kinds of things. At a really high level, this works because of a technique called hydration with React. And I just will explain how this works really quick. With a Gatsby static page, when a user types in the URL and they view that page, the first thing they're served right away, the static HTML file that was created when Gatsby rendered and built that page initially. React, as a framework, is all about managing the state of your HTML DOM. And so how it's worked is React created a DOM representation for the recipe template for an anonymous user. Gatsby rendered that as a static HTML file, serves it to the user. The user views the page. After the HTML is loaded, you can also load the JavaScript code bundle alongside of it. It can recognize, hey, this is a page that was created using these React components. And you can essentially like pour React into an existing DOM. And what it'll say is like, oh, this is the state of the application. I'll just start from right here. Instead of like the React having to bootstrap and build the entire DOM from scratch, you're kind of saying, well, here's the application state that I want you to start from. Effectively, what that means is you can get a really fast HTML page served to an anonymous user as just static HTML. After the browser has done the work of loading that and displaying that page, you can pour in or add the JavaScript application on top of it. It's invisible to the user, but after a couple seconds, it'll perform just like a React application at that point instead of a static HTML pages. This allows you to do some neat things. A couple of examples are you can create hybrid pages. I think of this as like a use case for the scenario where a large portion of the page is like generic static content. So it benefits a lot from being statically rendered because the page will display for users a lot faster, but there may be elements of the page that are specific to a user. So this is an example of the session schedule from Drupal Europe. 99% of this page is exactly the same for every single person that views it. The one part that isn't is this link here under each one that says mark as favorite. So this page, as it's generated by Drupal, has to be generated unique for every user because it has, this might be, if I've logged in and I've marked this as favorite, it'll have to display different than for someone who hasn't. A hybrid page would be a scenario where maybe what you could do is generate all of the content on this page as static HTML except for this link. Let the browser load that page. Once the application's kicked in and it's figured out that there's a user authenticated, then just pop these links into the page in a dynamic way. So they'll still get the benefit of the page loading really fast, but they can also personalize it for that use case. Another example use case, in Gatsby, we refer to this as a client-only route. These are pages where the vast majority of the page is dynamic. Like there is little benefit to generating a static version of this because you would literally have to generate a different static page for every single user on the site. Gatsby allows you to define, hey, I want you to create a wrapper, an HTML wrapper for the page that exists at this route. But other than that, I don't really want you to do anything. I just want you to treat this as a regular React application. So when the user visits the page that is a client-only route, it won't load quite as fast because it doesn't have the statically rendered HTML. It just has kind of an app wrapper. It then loads React into the page, but at that point, React has to do all the work of making requests to an API and figuring out which content to display on the page. That is no different than if you were to just, say, use something like Create React App to sort of bootstrap a regular React application. An example of what this might look like from a code perspective, you could, in Gatsby, do something like you want to render. This example uses tutorials. I've also done this with like recipes. But let's say you've got pages on your site where it requires a user to be logged in to view the full content of the page. So the scenario is you go to the site as an anonymous user, you see a teaser of the content and a prompt to sign up and log in. And then once you've logged in, you get the full version of the content on that page. So Gatsby allows me to generate the summary or teaser version for anonymous users as a static page. That'll load super, super fast, whether you're logged in or not. because this React component has a little bit of state logic in it. It says, hey, is the user currently logged in? Well, if it's Gatsby that's rendering the page, no, there's nobody logged in. So it'll just use this teaser component to render whatever HTML, and that's what's saved to the static HTML file. Once React has hydrated this page in the user's browser, it'll say, oh, shoot, there is someone logged in. And React will do exactly what it was designed to. It'll say, there is a change in the state of this application. I need to re-render this part of the DOM, and it'll use the sort of full version of the tutorial component. In this case, what that one does is it, after that tutorial component is loaded, it just makes a API request back to Drupal with the authenticated user's credentials, and it says, hey, Joe's logged into the site. Can I get the full content for this page? Drupal sends it back via JSON API, and you stick it into the page. I have an actual demo of this that makes it a little bit easier to visualize what's going on here. So we can look at that really quick. We're going to look at this Gatsby Guides site. Oh, if I can figure out how to use my computer. All right, I'm going to show a couple of things. We're going to do, so first off, the site in question here is gatsbyguides.com. This is very meta. This is a site that I've worked on to help explain how to build Gatsby sites using Drupal. That is a Gatsby site using Drupal. It's like the tutorial. This is a bunch of tutorials that essentially explain how to build this website. This is what you get as an anonymous user. You come to the page, you're not logged in. You can scroll through. You can see things like Gatsby's really fast. I click on a link, it takes me to the page. Subsequent page loads are like almost instantaneous. This is because it's prefetching these routes and caching them before I've even clicked on it. The first couple of times that I did this, I would build the site, and then I would sit there and spend like 5 minutes just clicking on the page, being like, holy shit, that's fast. Giddy about HTML pages in a way that I hadn't been since like many years ago. It was kind of fun. So you click around on pages. I can then click on login in this case. This is going to, the way that we've got it implemented is this will actually take me over to a Drupal 8 site. Using the simple OAuth module. I'm actually already logged in. As you can probably tell, I'm logged into this Drupal 8 site. So I'm just going to say grant access to the Gatsby Guide site, to my user account. Now when I'm back over here on the Gatsby site, you can see it's changed. I'm logged in. If I navigate to a tutorial page, instead of getting the teaser version, I actually get the full version. You can see it does this momentary loading bar at the bottom. What we've done in this to sort of make it perceived as much faster is we render the teaser content, which doesn't change, like the content at the top of the page, the teaser is the same whether you're logged in or not. And so we just show that, and it's super unlikely that you're going to read all of that before the rest of the page has loaded. So it still feels really quick. This is an example of that tutorial component where, depending on whether you're logged in or not, it renders different HTML. I also wanted to show some of the cool things in the Gatsby developer experience. So I've got this site set up on my local host. These are all the files that make up my Gatsby site. I know this is the root of the site because it's got things like gatsbyconfig.js, etc. I can run the Gatsby develop command. When I do that, what this is going to do is it says, oh, you're using the Drupal source plugin. I'm going to go off and fetch all of the data from the JSON API, pull that into Gatsby's GraphQL store, bootstrap the Gatsby application. It does that relatively quickly. Like in this case, you can see it sourced all of the data that it needed from Drupal in 1.09 seconds. And in my case, it's only there's probably 60 nodes that it's pulling in, but it's pretty darn fast. Once it's built the site, it gives me a localhost server that I can go and view to preview my site. It also gives me access to this GraphQL debugging and previewing tool, which we'll take a look at. And this. So now I've got the site running over here. Right, there's the localhost one. So I'm on localhost now. if I scroll down and I look at one of these pages, look at the whole Hello World page, I can go over on this side, I've got my code for it, and this is sort of the developer experience of Gatsby, which I really like, because I can go and edit one of these components. I don't know, I'll edit the tutorial. This is the teaser component. I can go like this. I can make some changes to it, like, maybe I want, like, make my site blazing. I edit that, I hit save, and like it almost instantaneously updates on the other side. This is true of editing React components, of editing CSS files. The sort of real-time preview of this is pretty neat as a developer experience. It's also really cool as a learning tool. With very little work, you could set up a Gatsby site sourcing content from Drupal, and now you have an opportunity to play around with React components and start to make changes to it and get a better understanding of how React works, while in real time seeing what those changes look like and having real data to work with instead of just a bunch of lorem ipsum, which is pretty neat. The other thing I wanted to show is this GraphQL tool, which is Gatsby added at localhost 8000 _ GraphQL. This tool, bummer, you can't really see what I'm going to type here, is a way to quickly preview GraphQL queries, and I will, let's see, we'll see if I can get it onto the page. Oh no, tutorial, boo, let's do, still can't. There we go. That's a tool for sort of creating queries against the GraphQL store that Gatsby created when it pulled in data from Drupal and elsewhere, so I can get a sense for what those look like. And it has some neat utilities like autocomplete. And as an example, I said query and get all of the node tutorials from the Drupal site. I'm going to get a list of them. I can hit control space, and it'll give me a list. These are all the fields from Drupal that we pulled into the GraphQL store. And I'm like, oh, I want the title, and I want the path, and from that I want the alias. I can create GraphQL queries here and run them and see what data they'll return, which is a pretty neat thing. I think about this a lot in comparison to the experience that you have in Drupal when you're creating Twig template files and you're trying to figure out what data is available for me to print out on the page in this particular Twig template file. And you have to go through this process of running using Twig's dump function and then inspecting all of the existing variables that are available. The Gatsby equivalent of that is you go to this GraphQL tool, I create a GraphQL query where I can explore the data that's available, request exactly and only the data that I need for my particular component, basically copy and paste this query that I created here over to my React component in Gatsby, and I'll know what that data is going to be and the shape that it's going to be in, which is a neat experience, I think. So, kind of a quick preview of some of the things. And what else? You can check out the Gatsby Guide site to kind of get a sense of how more of that is working if you're interested. Or, of course, ask me. I'm happy to chat about it. As I've worked with Gatsby and Drupal in conjunction with one another, some of the things that I've kind of run into or been thinking about that I am always looking for kind of better solutions for. One of them is how do you handle deployment of new content from Drupal? The scenario is you add content in Drupal, an editor maybe adds a couple of articles. In order to get that new content on your Gatsby site, something or someone needs to run the Gatsby build process and synchronize the files that it creates to the server. There are a lot of possible solutions for this problem. I know Jesus has done some work with creating a Drupal module that allows you to trigger deploys from within Drupal. I've thought a bit about being able to do things like use Drupal hooks to say, well, content was updated, run the build process, which might work in some scenarios or potentially hard in others because people might The scenario there is like an editor. If you're only adding blog posts once in a while, something like that might work fine. If you've got multiple editors that are adding and editing content frequently, you don't necessarily want to rebuild the site on every single edit. You might want to let them enter in all of the articles for the next day, and then run a deployment that deploys all of them at the same time. This also has some really interesting implications, like the ability to allow editors to add and modify content in your Drupal site that does not affect the live site, to build a preview environment, because you can run Gatsby build and ship those files to a different server instead of your production server. Let editors see what their site's going to look like once those changes go live. They can tweak things. Eventually they're happy with it. Now they just change the configuration and deploy to the live server instead. Something like that would be pretty cool. Drupal has support for GraphQL. There's a module you can install, much like the JSON API module. It's pretty much zero configuration. Takes all of your entity data and transports it to GraphQL. That, combined with the fact that Gatsby has a sort of generic GraphQL source plugin, where it can say, instead of pulling data in from JSON API and ingesting it into GraphQL, it can just stitch an existing GraphQL schema into Gatsby's GraphQL schema. And I think it might be interesting to experiment with that a little bit as a way to ingest data. And also, in particular, you could then, in your component that makes a request to Drupal for authenticated user data, developers could be making GraphQL requests instead of JSON API requests, which just helps further unify that experience that the front-end developer has when they're writing code. I would probably also think about implementing something like client-side caching for those authenticated API requests, so that, like in the way it's set up right now, every time you view the page, it makes the request again. It could probably be smart about sticking the resulting data into like local storage or something, so that it's faster on subsequent page requests. A couple gotchas or things to think about if you're going to work with Gatsby and Drupal. Definitely use the JSON API extras module. It allows you to disable JSON API resources that you're not using, which helps speed up the build time. It also helps reduce the sort of attack surface of your Drupal site. Like why expose data or possible egress points that you don't need to. When you're pulling in data from Drupal text fields into Gatsby and a few other field types, remember that in Drupal, you automatically get a bunch of filtering that happens on user-entered text. If they enter text into a text area and then they save it, all of the text format things are run on it. It does XSS filtering. It maybe does some cleaning up of faulty HTML and so forth. And then on the Drupal side, you get a processed version of the text and you get a raw or unprocessed version of the text. Gatsby sees both of those and it just ingests them equally, and Gatsby doesn't really understand that those are two different things. And on the Gatsby side, you could just output like raw values, which isn't necessarily safe because they haven't been sanitized. And it's a bad idea to output unsanitized user input. Another thing that I have not yet dealt with, but I know is possible, is figuring out how to handle the redirects. So in Drupal, you've got path auto enabled. You change the title of a node, it changes the path of the node. And if you're building all of your routes in Gatsby off of the aliases in Drupal, that means that alias will update next time you build. So you should probably also handle the redirect for that. This is totally possible. I just haven't done it yet. Yeah, that's it. I like this all. I think that Gatsby's fun because it's blazing fast, and it's kind of fun to build a website that you can just click around and be excited about, like, dang, these pages are fast. That was fun. It was also fun for me as an experience to get to learn React better. I think that I learned React better and more quickly by building sites with Gatsby than I would have if I had just started with React from scratch. And I think that's because I was able to really quickly start using React to solve real problems and not just things that I was making up as part of the learning experience. Gatsby is really good at sourcing data from structured APIs. Pretty much anything that you can read with Node, Gatsby can ingest that data, which means you can do some interesting things like maybe pull in data from two different sources. You could pull in data from Drupal. You could recognize that some of the data in Drupal has a or you could pull in data from Drupal. You could also pull in data from the Twitter API or from the Airtable API. You could then build a page writing a GraphQL query that takes data from both of those places and assembles it together into a single page. That's kind of neat. Drupal is awesome, especially when we're dealing with complex editorial workflows. I think of this as being interesting because it's a stack that I think has a lot of potential to start out pretty easily, but grow with you as your application and your use cases grow. So, yeah, that's what I know about Gatsby and Drupal. And I'm happy to answer questions. We're like at the time limit, but they won't kick us out yet. So,
could you please clarify the moment when you updated the content on the back end?
mm-hmm.
How to resolve the updating of the content? Because I'm not clear. Is it like pulling automatically or?
Sure. Yep. So the question is, how does it, like when you update content in Drupal, how do you reconcile it so that the Gatsby site also has the updated content? The answer to that is you need to rerun Gatsby's build command each time you update content in Drupal.
So it's not really a solution for a news website?
It could be. I mean, is this a good solution for a news website or a website that has frequent content changes? It could be. You could automate a lot of that process. You could write logic in the Drupal application that says when these conditions are met, trigger a deployment. Like trigger Jenkins or something to tell Gatsby to run its build process and ship the files to the production server. It might take a couple of minutes.
In this case, we have to do a blue-green deployment because there's going to be a downtime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, you could do, right, you would, in order to avoid downtime, you would sort of deploy this to a different setup and switch between them. Or you could use tools like Netlify, which basically do that for you already.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few options. You could also do some neat things too, where you could write your components that render the HTML in such a way that you render a bunch of static HTML and then do something like component did mount in React. And when the Gatsby application is static pages are hydrated with React, that code could run. It could make a query to your news database and say, oh, there's articles that have been added to the database that aren't present in the static page, and then just populate the page with those.
How it works with the videos and streaming, and does it like support streaming video, downloading the content part as a stream, for instance?
Yeah, Gatsby, in terms of like video support, Gatsby wouldn't do anything special for you. You would just figure out what HTML you need Gatsby to render in order to display the video player and point to that source.
Yeah, there's a bunch of talking about videos, plugins for embed media.
Sure, and so there are a bunch of plugins that you can use in conjunction with Gatsby that would say, hey, this is Markdown, and you've used this particular token that is representative of a video in YouTube. Instead of rendering the link to YouTube, I should render this as an embedded YouTube video player. Exactly what you would do with Drupal in that scenario. You teach Drupal how to convert some tokenized representation of the media asset to HTML that the browser can understand. You would, in this case, you might even do something like, use entity embed in Drupal, have Drupal render the HTML, and then just use the HTML that Drupal rendered directly in Gatsby instead of asking Gatsby to render it. So then you can make use of some of Drupal's tools for like embedding media, and that kind of stuff.
And for GraphQL, I didn't use it all. I mean, just something new to me. Where it stores the data? On the client side?
The way that Gatsby handles GraphQL and the way that it deals with it is when you run Gatsby build, at build time, it creates a new GraphQL database and it populates it. Those files are all stored just on whatever environment Gatsby build is being run on. It uses that Gatsby database populated with data from whatever sources to build the current HTML, and then it trashes the database. So it doesn't actually keep the GraphQL database around in between builds. It's only used at build time. What it does do is Gatsby outputs the results of GraphQL queries as .json files that are included along with all of the static assets for the page. So when your React application runs a GraphQL query that is in there, what's happened is during build time, Gatsby said, hey, that's a GraphQL query. I'm going to run that query. Whatever the results are that it returns, I'm just going to stick into this JSON file. And then later on, if that query runs again, instead of going to the GraphQL database, I'm just going to read the JSON file and use the statically compiled data from there.
So does that mean that if only one node changed, you still have to run the whole thing, like it's not like incremental?
Yes, yep. Gatsby does not do incremental builds for content. So if you only changed the content of one node, you would end up rebuilding the entire thing. In my experience, that has not been problematic yet. I've also not had to use this. I've not even had the opportunity to try this for sites that have tens of thousands of nodes. I could see it being problematic there. I think you could, and as an example, the Gatsby Contentful source plugin is a little bit smarter about pulling in data from Contentful. And you could do this with Drupal as well, where you can make a JSON API request and check the HTTP headers. Has this changed since last time I requested it? And like locally cache things so that you're not having to that speed, but it does have to rebuild the whole site every time. This is also a thing that I know Gatsby Inc., the sort of corporate arm of Gatsby, is aware of, and is a problem that they're consciously trying to figure out a solution for. As we know with Drupal 8, like context of caching and tags is really hard. Hopefully they get there at some point, so you can just do incremental builds, but I personally don't foresee it happening for a while. So.
I was just going to say, I know that Gatsby's working.
Yeah, yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll be awesome once they figure it out. I'm just kind of like skeptical because I know how long it took Drupal 8 to figure it out.
So that one thing might disqualify it for liars for certain sites that I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Just the fact that it cannot be incrementally.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to be aware of, because it does mean that maybe this isn't the right solution for certain use cases. It's like if your content is in a place where it's updating, like you've got new nodes posted, like a couple new nodes a minute or at a rate that's higher than that, this is probably not a great solution for that. I mean, at that point, rendering things to static HTML is kind of defeats the purpose anyways. That's like every single page request almost is going to be different anyways.
Can't you put a CDN in front of it to kind of, while you're doing the builds, keep us?
Sure, there's lots of things you could do to say, like, keep serving the existing live site while the build happens in the background. Yep, absolutely. So then you have to start asking questions like, is it okay if a node gets posted but isn't available to the public for 5 minutes or 10 minutes? In a lot of cases, that's probably fine, right? Like, users are generally totally okay with, like, I hit save and it didn't show up right away because I scheduled it for publication tomorrow anyways. Facebook does some crazy stuff with this where, like, you could essentially like shard your data so that, like, for the one user who added the piece of content, you could display it to them, but everyone else sees the statically cached version of the site, and they'll eventually get the updated version, a couple of minutes later or whatever. It is totally I don't know, what's critical to your business and your application in terms of how fast things get published?
Yeah, the preview service from Gatsby allow you to do that with Contentful. And I know Sanity, the Sanity is headless CMS.
Mm-hmm.
They update the plugin, so it also have like incremental build and previews.
Yeah.
And regardless, talking about like with the plugin builds, the more it will grow, it allows you to define either when saving node, or by clicking the menu, or by cron when cron get executed. And the 2.0 version got released, and the module was updated by the Monte Pro people. They just take it to the next level. So now you can even create your own plugins or deploy into whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, I'm gonna cut us off because we're quite a bit over at this point. But I will be around, and I'm happy to try to answer more questions.